So where did your musical journey begin?
Well, for me, the gateway into music was really through writing. I fell in love with poetry at a really, really young age. I'd been writing poems and stories since I could read. And when I was 9, I started singing lessons. And soon after that, I realized I could put all those poems and stories to music and write songs. And after that, I never wanted to do anything else. But I didn't start picking up instruments till much later. I didn't start playing guitar till 17. Picked up guitar. I wanted to be able to flesh out my own songs and articulate the songs in my head on an instrument harmonically. And in my late teens, recognized the importance of that and the power that gives you as a writer and as a creative. And then when I was 17, I grew up in the Northeast. I went down to Nashville for the first time. I had a manager at the time who said, you know, your songs are kind of country. They kind of have a country influence. And I thought, what? I didn't grow up listening to country music. I grew up listening to classic rock and classic R&B and the divas of the 90s, a lot of that pop music. Mm-hmm. And the extent of country I knew was Shania Twain, you know? Uh-huh. And I'd heard of Garth Brooks. It was like that. And I went down to Nashville and I went to a show at the Bluebird Cafe. And that was it for me. I fell in love with country music. I went all the way back to the beginning. I went to the Carter family and Hank Williams and went all the way forward and listened to everything and just fell in love with it.
When did you start to recognize that there were session players that were the instrumentalists on a lot of these records that you were listening to?
I was lucky enough to be connected to Mac McAnally when I was 20 years old through a friend of a friend, Mike Ramos, who actually manages Jimmy Buffett, and he'll come into my story later in a really big way as well. But I was lucky enough to meet Mac McAnally, and he set up a session for me. I was making independent records at the time. I had no idea what I was doing, but I was writing and self-producing my own records in New York. And I came down here, and Mac McAnally set up an incredible session for me with Greg Morrow and Chad Cromwell on drums, and Glenn Worf on bass, Steve Nathan on keys, Tom Bukovac on guitar. Keep in mind, and Mac McAnally on acoustic. Keep in mind, this is my first Nashville session, and I was so naive and so blown away. I will never forget. I mean, those were two of the best days of my entire life to this day. It was so mind-blowing to me, the experience of people sitting in a room at that level of craftsmanship and playing my songs. I just could not get over it. And they were so kind to me. Now looking back, knowing how naive I was, knowing how little I knew about how Nashville worked, how the session musician world worked, they were so patient and so kind to me. And we had the best time because I think they saw how wide-eyed and passionate I was. I think they always appreciate that. And I was just completely in awe of their musicianship.
So when you think about those gentlemen as they're laying down the parts for your songs, as you being a songwriter and a musician that has a vision for it, are there any things that come to mind in that experience that really drew you to want to work with them again, or that you were really impressed by outside of their, just natural ability to be able to jump in and make something sound like a record right away? Were there any things that you took away from that you were like, wow, that's someone that I really feel like can have an impact on my music going forward because of maybe something they did or a certain approach? Or
all of the above. What stuck out to me in those early days was the ability to pivot stylistically, sonically, just the amount of tools that these guys have in their toolboxes, and the hours and hours. And I know this as a player who models myself after these people and looks up to these people as heroes. The hours and hours and hours and amount of times that you have to experiment and try and fail and realize that it doesn't work in the mix and realize that it doesn't sound good on record, or realize that it's not poking out in the way that you want it to sonically. When you actually know how many reps that takes, it makes it even more incredible, not less. So I hope I'm not being too much of a fangirl, but that's truly how I feel. Right. And when I first started playing on my records and playing on master recordings, when I really had a team and a co-producer and wanted to be more intentional and more excellent in my parts, that's when you really realize how hard it is. But I think that every single session player brings his or her own unique like soul fingerprint, much in the same way that as an artist or a songwriter, I mean, they're just as much artists as we are. They're just in a different industry, and they're in a service industry. So in some ways, they actually have to be more diversely talented, because they have to be able to completely, like a chameleon, shed that skin and try on another one while retaining their essential artistry and their essential craftsmanship, because you can't really be what you aren't,
Right.
And so I think the best session players are themselves, no matter what they're playing, and they're able to inject their soul and themselves into whatever they're playing and whatever sound the producer or the artist wants.
So as you've learned so much from them in the years of having that experience of being the artist who's also playing on your records, and it sounds like you have an interest in modeling some of the principles, that you've learned from them around that. Are there any things that you've done in your practice that has helped you kind of take some of the things that you've learned in that and become more proficient on that side of the
Absolutely. And playing live is very different. In some ways they go together, the two crafts of playing in the studio, playing on a record, and then playing live. In some ways they go together, right? Tuning and timing are very important in both. I'd say timing even more so. You can get away with a little bit of slip on tuning live. I noticed that as the show goes on, there's a little more of this going on. Uh-huh. But timing was a huge one for me, because I'd been playing solo acoustic shows since I was in my late teens. I never really played in a band. I was a singer-songwriter. And I came up, like I said, playing alone on stage. So timing was huge for me. The first time that I was on a major tour, playing with a band, playing to a click, playing on records, my own records to a click, learning to sit in a pocket, not be too robotic. I mean, this is stuff that obviously session players take for granted. But when you're first learning to do that, it's really difficult coming from a singer-songwriter background. So I'd say timing and tuning and touch and tone. I'd say tone is something that also translates live, playing in the Zac Brown Band and learning how to fit into their mix, which already they have 8 people on stage. It's a full mix, and they certainly don't need me. They've been doing just fine without me for over a decade. The fact that they gave me an opportunity to stand on their stage and actually learn on the fly of how to fit into their mix and what to play to even be heard over the other 8 instruments going on stage, to be heard and to fit in and to contribute something, because Zac is such an intricate acoustic guitar player and nylon guitar player. So I'm primarily playing second acoustic, rhythm acoustic with them. So really learning how to be essentially a shaker, and then picking moments where I can add something else, syncopation-wise. But same thing with organ. David Dorn taught me how to play the organ. He gave me a crash course in organ when I joined the Zac Brown Band, because Zac wanted me to cover some B3 on songs where Clay and Coy play lead guitar. And I've played keys since I was a little girl, but I'd never played organ. It's a totally different instrument, obviously. Right. Thank God I play keyboards. But David Dorn gave me a crash course and taught me what a glue organ is, sonically and tonally, and how to tweak the tones in the organ, like the basic trick. He taught me, the basic organ tricks that make you sound like you know what you're doing and how to play organ. But all of these contributions in the Zac Brown Band are really just hopefully tiny little sonic additives to what they're doing that just makes the mix feel that much better. When
you think about like those early sessions where maybe you didn't have all the words yet to communicate,
yeah.
do you remember any, even if it's not specific, but generalized like things that the musicians did to make you feel more comfortable, that left you feeling more, you mentioned them being very patient with you, like the first time that you were, working through things.
For me, the most intimidating moments have been when I've played live and sung in a session, because as soon as you turn on a microphone and are playing an instrument with those guys, at least I feel very intimidated, because the level obviously at which they can lay down a track has been very different than what I've been able to do. I'm slowly but surely closing that gap. That's my goal in life. Like I said, I know what the bar is. So with that said, there are times many times where I have parts in mind for my songs, and I've found over the years, I've tried different things. I've tried demoing out the parts and the band playing along with them, but there's kind of an energy that you lose. And then if you choose to play with the band, A, you better not mess them up, if you're not right on. And B, then you can't really use those live vocal takes, which I love using tracking vocal takes because there's just an energy that you won't really get back. And so all of those things need to be weighed. Another option that I've tried is telling people I'm going to play this part, telling the guitar players I'm going to play this part. So keep that, try to imagine it. And they can do that, but that's also hard. If they're hearing it live, it's much easier for them. Figuring out how to do that overdub wise, usually I end up overdubbing those parts. That's a challenge I still don't have the answer to. I don't know what the best option there is. Obviously, the best option is to be as good as a session player and nail it live, And my current co-producer, Brandon Hood, he's really good at that. He's great at playing with the band and producing. But as an artist, it's a lot of hats to wear to be singing and playing and producing. And I feel like one of those things starts to slip, or all of those things start to slip. So usually I won't play, and I'll try somehow to articulate what my parts are going to be later, or I try to demo them and have them in.
When you're trying to share a part that you're playing with, or share a part that you would want another musician to play, are there any specific ways that that you've learned that is easier to communicate that with them in the way that certain players may have a specific rhythm or specific fingering of a voice scene or something like that?
Usually it's pretty easy because I'll just sing the part or play the part. And I don't find that as difficult to articulate as I do certain sonic descriptions that are more esoteric. It's not just as simple as more high end or more low end. Sometimes you get a little bit poetic, and that I actually find that really fun. And I've found that that's what keeps me coming back to some players, is that you end up just having the same sonic taste as them just naturally. And when you find someone like that, it's a great match. And it's not so much that they know exactly what you want, is that they just happen to like exactly what you want, so they'll gravitate towards that naturally. And I love that. It's like a real synchronicity, it's like finding a friend musically.
Yeah.
But sometimes describing that to someone for whom that wasn't their first choice, or that wasn't the first thing they heard, and describing, I want it to sound more belly or more sparkly or more, some of these more poetic words are more like a glow instead of like a neon light. You never want to fall too much into the artist cliche of what is she talking about? But sometimes those words can really inspire people, and especially as a songwriter and someone who loves poetry, it can be really inspiring. But I also realized I didn't answer your question about what musicians have done to make me feel more comfortable. When I have played live, they've just been so forgiving if I mess up or don't do well. And I think hopefully, if I may be so bold, I think they probably admire and respect that I want to play live with them, or that I can play. And even if I'm not as good as them, obviously, that I have that desire and have the courage to pull that out. So they're very patient and sweet about that, because they were there once too, and hopefully you treat people the way that you would have wanted to have been treated.
Right.
And I think they're all, at least all the guys at the top, are really, really sweet about that.
I think I notice a lot when session players take a moment to give some sort of compliment to the artist, and they will only do it when it's authentic, which I think is an important thing too, because you can be found out pretty quickly if everyone in the room knows that really wasn't, the artist knows that wasn't a really great vocal take, and somebody just told me, man, you killed that vocal just for saying it. But they do it authentically, and they find something where we get the end of that first take, the first song of the day. The artist may be looking a little bit nervous or uneasy, and someone will go on the talk back and say, man, that was an incredible vocal, and then all of a sudden the artist lights up.
It makes your whole day. Yeah. So, and same for musicians. I always try to, actually, I don't even try to make a point. It just happens naturally because I'm such a fangirl that I'm like, oh my God, that part is so cool, or I love that melody, or I loved that lick, or I loved, that tom fill, or whatever it is. I'm sure they're used to that, but
But everybody likes being complimented.
Yeah, no one doesn't like being complimented. And especially it helps so much directionally. Like if you play down a song once or twice and then someone is able to compliment you on a specific part, specific lick, fill, whatever it may be, that really helps you start refining your part in your mind based on what they responded to.
So when you got to the point where you're a little bit more experienced in the Nashville scene, you understand kind of how the production process, generally works. As an artist, you're expanding on your projects, you're co-producing your projects, you're playing on them. What sort of things go into your selection process with you and your co-producers on how you choose musicians?
Well, it's tough to choose because there's a lot of amazing musicians in this town, and a lot of it ends up being the initial group that you vibe with and their kind of extended network, right? At least I think it's all relationships. For me, the musicians that I keep coming back to are the ones whose taste I share, who just naturally gravitate towards the kinds of parts and sounds that lend itself to my style and my production. And that's just something you find through experience over time. I also really value musicians who have a producer mindset, and most of the best ones do, who are able to challenge me and give me ideas for the production, give me ideas for the arrangement. I really welcome that. I know not all producers do. Actually, through the years, as I've become more experienced and more confident, I've become less dogmatic about what I bring into the studio, the arrangements, and less set in my ways and more open, more creatively open. And I think it's ironic, but actually experiencing confidence gives you that more, because I think in the beginning, especially as a young person and an experienced person, and especially as a woman, you're just trying so hard to come in with authority and direction because you want to be taken seriously. And so in the beginning, that's your sole goal, And then as you hopefully earn that respect, you kind of relax a little and you actually end up being much more creatively free, and you get much better ideas and performances out of the session players because they feel that. And so they can actually bring and contribute a lot more. So I actually love musicians who are outspoken in a good way, in a respectful way, which most of them are, and who bring arrangement ideas and crazy ones. I mean, I'm very creatively open, and I have a lot of creative freedom thanks to my team. So I want to try a modulation, or I want to try a crazy bridge, or I love bringing those ideas to the tables, and I don't mind going down a rabbit hole and it not working, because in the event that it does work and it makes the entire song, I love that stuff, right. And I'm a player too. So that kind of stuff is really fun for me. So I love musicians that love to layer, that play a bunch of different instruments. I love folks who are diverse that way. I love Jason Roller because he plays everything. And it's just so interesting to see how he layers things. And he has such a characteristic style. I mean, all my favorite players do. So it's really also knowing what you want on a certain song in every instrument, because everyone is so different. As you have the privilege to work with different session players, you realize how different everyone's style is and sound is. And then you can kind of cast, as Brandon Hood says, my co-producer, he says, half of it is casting.
And that can be something that there's kind of some mixed opinions on in different worlds, because in Nashville, because generally in order to exist as a studio musician, you kind of have to be able to do anything as far as like cover, genres, especially if you're a player that came up in like the demo world, where like you're going to be recording 6 songs in 3 hours, and every one of those songs may have a different lean to them, genre wise or style wise or whatever. So it can be argued like, well, if you've gotten to this point where you're on the list of the potential options, they can kind of all play everything.
Yeah.
But then there's the more focused casting sort of idea that like, yeah, they can play everything, but who are the ones that are going to connect the most to what we're trying to do? And that's where I lean. But there's those sides of that, and it sounds like you're really focused on like not just do they have the ability, but like do they feel like really connected to it?
Yes, and for whom is the style of that song most natural, and most authentic, and is going to be able to put their heart and soul into it in the most authentic way. Mac McAnally always jokes about he was on a session and he played something down the first time that the producer didn't like, and the producer said that he didn't like it. Can you try something else? And Mac said, well, okay, now that we've ruled out what's in my heart, I'll do this.
So do you find yourself in general like that you've found like a group that seems to work well in general for your songs, or are there certain songs that come across where you're like, this song I think this person may be really more inclined for than?
I'd say both. And yes. I have a group, a pool of musicians that I've worked with that I absolutely love and respect the heck out of. But I love experimenting, and there's so many talented musicians in this town. I want to learn. I want to challenge myself. I want to grow. If you always record with the same people and always create with the same people, at some point the comfortability, which is good in one area, but again, there's pros and cons to everything, right? The comfortability can keep you from growing, even working with the same production team for your whole life. You got to change it up. And as an artist, especially on this new record, I changed it up a little bit. I want to feel those butterflies. I want to be nervous. I want to have to prove myself every single time. And I think that lends itself a lot to creativity and innovation on your part, because then if you're on your toes, everyone else feels that. And I never want to walk into a session, I'm on my third album now, and feel like, oh, we're doing this again. I know how to do this. It's antithetical to creativity and to a good record. Mm-hmm. And so I'm always trying to push myself. And you see that great artists do that. That's why they change up their teams and change up their collaborators, and it's for them more than anything else, mm-hmm. And I think people forget that. Obviously, there's a lot to be said for loyalty, but it has nothing to do with loyalty, really. It has to do with creativity and evolution. If you're friends with the people you've been with, you'll be friends with them forever, and you'll come back to them in a different way as a better artist for having worked with other people. Yeah,
I agree. It can be really challenging when you have a project or a certain artist that you really love working with, and it makes sense for them to try something different and move on. And you're like, but I wish I could be a part of it. But you have to support them. And as musicians, as producers and engineers, we want to make sure. I think it's really important to not take it personally. I had something kind of like that happen a couple of years ago, and I called one of my mentors, and I was like, man, I'm just feeling like really bummed out.
Yeah.
I spent like this last year building a really strong relationship with these people. I absolutely love working with them. I feel more inspired every time I leave a session with them, and all of a sudden they just kind of like stopped calling, and I just learned that this other person is they're working at at this place now. And then I found out later that it was like totally random. And then within 6 months we were working together again.
Yeah, exactly.
On other stuff. It was just like a moment thing where like, and that stuff will just happen, and it'll come back around.
It will.
But because of how much we love and we care about the work that we do, we can unfortunately take it personally until we learn the process not to, or just how to work through it. 'Cause it still feels like something, regardless of how aware of it being important to separate yourself from.
Yeah, and there's a real temptation, especially in this town, because there's a lot of people who have been around for decades, and it takes decades to be a really great craftsman in any of these crafts. There's real temptation around being cynical and being jaded, and they just want to work with this person because they're successful. They just want, work with this person because they're hot right now. And I would encourage musicians to try to me, that's the easy road. Don't say things like that. Don't be one of the cynics in this town. Don't be one of the jaded people in this town. Like, don't put all your eggs in one basket either. Be on a bunch of different gigs, ingratiate yourself and connect with a bunch of different artists and songwriters and producers, and become your own brand and your own entrepreneur and your own entity. And don't rely on one person for all your work or one producer for all your work. And if it happens that way, then great. But look at yourself, like have pride in yourself as a business and an entrepreneur, and understand that if you lose one gig, you'll get 5 more. Like have enough confidence in yourself. I think there's just such a tendency to say, oh, that person wasn't loyal. They just went to someone who just had a #1 hit, or and it's... Yeah. Oh, it just sucks all the energy out of people. Like I see it all the time in this town. And I would just really encourage people to not have that low-hanging fruit mentality. Like we can do better than that.
So on the live side of things, joining the Zac Brown Band, tell me how that came together.
I really owe the career that I have to touring. Zac was the first star to take me under his wing and mentor me and offer me a slot on a big tour. That was 2017. I was supposed to open 2 shows for them, and I opened the 2 shows and then ended up opening the whole summer tour. I had never been on a major tour like that. I'd been dreaming of it for years and years, and Zac and I really connected. Zac, talk about mentors. He is such a supporter of new artists. He's so passionate about music and folks innovating and being original. He just really took me under his wing. I sat in with them every night on a song, and I opened for them on and off for 3 years. And then the pandemic hit, and I didn't hear from them for a while and just assumed that I would go my way. And, I'm always friends with Zac. I wasn't worried about that. But again, this is kind of what we're talking about. Like, it never occurred to me like, oh, I'm not opening for them again. It's just important never to be entitled that way. I was so grateful for the opportunity, and I knew they were going another direction, and they'd announced their tour. And in June, I got a call from Zac, and he asked me to come out and play utilities in the band, basically. And I was completely shocked because they had a bunch of guitar parts, and their new record, their most recent record, The Comeback, had a bunch of parts that they couldn't all cover, even as 8 people. And they don't, we don't really play tracks. We play tracks on like 3 songs that have a few electronic effects and things that are very essential to the record. So they asked me to come out and kind of cover some acoustic and cover some B3, which I didn't know how to play at the time. And
you said absolutely, right?
Yeah. Yes, I did. And cover some rhythm electric and just kind of whatever they need. And so I had to learn, they change up their set list every night. So I had to learn about 60 or 70 songs. I knew most of their music, but it's different to actually sit down and really learn it and be prepared to actually play it on stage. Mm-hmm. And so I had to learn 60 or 70 songs in like a month. And it was so fun. It was so exciting. It was so terrifying and exhilarating. And I was so nervous to get out there, but just so honored that they wanted me on their stage. I just couldn't believe it. I felt so underqualified, but so honored and so excited. And so I started touring with them actually in the band. That was in 2021. And then last year I continued, they kept asking me back and asking me to, at first I thought, oh, I'm just kind of a guest on their tour because Daryl Scott's done that. And then they kept asking me to things like the CMA Awards. And I was like, that's different, that's beyond tour. And eventually joined the band officially and as the first female member, which is such an honor.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. It's such a fun gig. I'd never been a sideman before, and to try to figure out how to contribute, like take all the energy that I put into my songs and my vision and my production and my records and take all that energy and just put it into super serving someone else's vision, someone else's record is so much fun.
So in the process of kind of learning on the fly with these songs, do you get any feedback, or have you gotten any feedback on certain parts from the MD or the band or Zac on like things that you might adjust or try differently? And then how do you kind of respond to that and figure it out?
I love when collaborators that I'm working with specifically say, no, play this part, play this voicing, play 8th notes instead of 16th notes, play 16th notes instead of quarter notes, whatever it is. I love that because then I have a direction. And I obviously love being creative too, but especially when it comes to contributing to a larger collective, I'd almost rather be told what to play and then figure out how to play it really well and then insert my personality in it over time. So I love having designated parts because also the person who came up with those parts or the people who are telling me to play those parts are really experienced and know what sounds good. And so I love learning that. I'm always logging that stuff.
What have you learned from being in a band that might translate into your own artistry?
So much, Gio. Oh my gosh. The biggest takeaway from being in the Zac Brown Band for me has been to be less uptight. They would all laugh so hard when they see this. To be less uptight and to be more raw and to experience and experiment more while on stage. Because it really is about the energy in the collective on stage. And the more that you're on stage, the less scary taking a risk on stage seems, and the more exciting and fun it seems, and actually the more it can pay off for the band and the audience on stage, especially when you've been doing it as long as they have. They're all about what we were talking about in the studio, right? They're all about trying to keep it fresh and challenge each other and stay on their toes. That actually becomes the challenge, much like in a marriage, when you have to discipline yourself to stay present and keep the respect and keep on your toes and not assume that you know the other person just because you know them so well, and that keeps the creativity and the inspiration alive. So what I've learned most from the Zac Brown Band is to take more risks, that it's about energy more than it's about precision and perfection, ironically, for the fact that being a studio musician is all about precision and perfection. But in the end, if it doesn't come with a whole lot of soul and energy, nobody cares, right? I mean, what we connect to in the records is the soul and the energy and the vibe. And I think as a perfectionist and someone who's very self-critical and someone who wants to have that precision and excellence as a musician, it's hard for me to remember that. And the Zac Brown Band has really reminded me of that.
On the artistry side of things, you have a really solid following and presence throughout the social media platforms. How does connecting with fans in that space versus like in front of on a stage, how do you find inspiration in the digital world versus the analog world of having somebody in front of you at your show?
I try to look at socials as an extension of who I am, how I am live in person. I think it's really important to be able to find ways to visually and through video, through social content, articulate who you are and what you're about in very short, succinct clips, preferably 3 seconds. It's so crazy now how short people's attention spans are. But I take that as a real challenge, and social media doesn't rule my life. That's really important as a creative person and as an artist to really discipline yourself that way. But because it doesn't rule my life, I really enjoy creating content for socials. Like, I think what we're doing is so cool right now. And this is the kind of stuff that I love to digest on socials and on YouTube and listen to podcasts and educate myself. It's just, I cannot get enough of this kind of stuff. So making sure that I showcase my instrumental passion on socials, making sure that I showcase the behind the scenes of recording music and producing music, behind the scenes of taking people out on tour, taking people inside the studio. I'm a musician. I'm not a lifestyle brand. I'm not a model. I think it's really important for artists to remember that and understand that. Not as much as musicians, because obviously their product is their music, but for artists, a lot of times it's really tempting to kind of play the looks card or play the lifestyle card or play the fame card. And I ultimately think that if you want to be taken seriously as a musician or a songwriter, that does more harm than good, at least for me and the brand I'm trying to put across. So I'm really intentional about what I put on socials, and I make sure that it is about my music in some way, shape, or form, and then let people enough into my life to feel like they know me, but keeping the focus on the music is really important to me.
So when you think about the qualities that will help you be able to continue to have continued success and growth, and you're going to give yourself advice from 17 years old picking up a guitar, what should you focus on? What do you feel like is the takeaway that you've learned that you wish you knew when you started?
It depends what you want, right? But for me, for what I want, actually, if I had had more of a technical foundation in guitar, I think that would have really served me. And it's something I'm making up for now, in terms of music theory, in terms of technique, all those things. I've been training myself the last few years. But I think if I had known at 17 what I know now, I would have majored in music or music theory in college instead of studying creative writing and anthropology and other things I was interested in. But I think I was intimidated by a lot of the classical musicians. I'd also been trained classically in opera vocally since I was 9, and I was kind of like, I'm done with, classical training. But I find music such an endless endeavor that I think it doesn't hurt to know the most about it possible. The most about technique, the most about theory, the most about music history, the most about all records, all parts. And the thing is, now no one has an excuse. Doesn't matter if you're my age or 17 or 50, it's not too late for you because YouTube. You can learn anything. You can literally create your own college because of the resources that are on the internet now. And if you just have some self-discipline and some focus and understand what you want to learn and how to hold yourself accountable to it, you can get good at anything musically. Just make sure you also get out there and play with people, because I think I sat at home for so many years trying to be perfect and trying to write my songs and learn. Like, nothing grows in isolation. You also have to get out there and get feedback. I got a lot of feedback from audiences, but I didn't really play with other musicians till I was in my late 20s. And that's something I would have done a lot sooner. But hindsight's 2020. I don't know if I would actually change it, because I think also in my young 20s, I developed such a sense of personhood as an artist and songwriter because I spent so much time writing by myself and playing by myself. So you don't know, you know?
Right. Thank you so much for joining us. I've learned so much and had just a blast. I feel more inspired now. So I just want to get to work on some records today.
Yes.
But I'm just so glad that you were able to come by and hang.